Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again today. It's a Friday. It is the last day of the longest month of our lives. It's January 31st. February is on the horizon. The depressing month that is January is almost gone. So, yeah, it's for some people especially, January is a very, very difficult month. So we're happy to get this out of the way. So that means we're getting closer to March Madness. We're getting closer to spring ball. And ultimately getting closer to regular football back on the screen. So we're here. It's exciting. All right, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert, before we start. At Black Desert Resort, you can truly indulge in luxury your way. Whether you choose a sleek studio or an expansive 4-bedroom suite, you're just moments away from teeing off on a championship golf course. Savoring top-tier dining, relaxing poolside, or exploring the rugged beauty of southern Utah. Whatever thrill you seek, it's right outside your door. Your journey awaits at blackdesertresort.com. Get lost and find luxury. All right, so earlier this week I told you that I probably wasn't going to do another episode this week unless something came up, and some stuff came up. So we'll do a podcast today, and we'll return again next week and have some more stuff. But happy to continue to talk to you about the different things going on around the collegiate world, the sports world, and look, we're not going to get into this debate, but like, if you have to weigh in on this whole Utah Hockey Club controversy in terms of them changing names, whatever, go for it. We're not going to discuss that, but it's been an interesting week. We'll just say that. So one of the things that happened pretty much after I wrapped up my podcast was the it happened that Kenan Johnson, cornerback at Utah, entered the transfer portal. And there's a few people that wondered how this was possible because it is past the date. He is a grad transfer, and so he can essentially leave whenever he wants. There is some rules that way, and so he's not bound to the same transfer portal rules that there are. So yes, there are still players that can leave who are grad transfers. But for all intents and purposes, he was locked into stay at the U, and everything was going to be there for him. And on the surface, this looks like a bad loss for Utah, right? Obviously, he got the starting minutes last year before he suffered that gruesome injury. But it's that injury that essentially is going to make it why he transferred. His timeline, as you can imagine with these long, sustained injury rehabs, was going to make it difficult for him to be able to return in time for the season. And so, I don't know if this was a mutual understanding, if this was Utah kind of pushing him out or whatever the decision was. This is the nature of college athletics now, right? But at the same time, there wasn't really going to be an opportunity for him at Utah given how long it would take. Right now, maybe there's a faster recovery. Maybe he's able to get back in there. But even then, I'm assuming based on what I've heard that he wasn't going to be able to be ready until probably, early-ish to mid-season. And, I never got clarification on whether that was, he was going to be able to start acclimating to the system, or if that was when he could, full go. Regardless, Utah's been down this road with Cam Rising. And I think the scars of having a player coming off of a serious injury, who is, trying to make a comeback, and obviously you want to be able to do right by him. They obviously wanted Kenan Johnson, right? Like he's a talented athlete. There's a reason why they wanted to keep him there. The progression and the future that they saw with him was bright. Even though he'd been in college long and was basically at the end of his career. But there was optimism that they could get something out of him. The problem is when you have injuries like that, it's tough to be able to hold up a roster spot for somebody that's not going to be fully ready for the rest of the year, right? And so I think, I'm operating on the assumption that this is mutual, right? Like I think they were both looking at it and saying, this isn't going to happen. But on Utah's side, this is them having to go the business route, right? And essentially saying that, they needed the roster spot and, they weren't going to be able to keep that scholarship essentially, right? This is my opinion, so don't say that this is, Utah Athletics doing that. I haven't gotten word that that's what it was. But just essentially, it's kind of putting two and two together on that situation. This gives Utah an opportunity now to have another scholarship player come in. You can go through the spring transfer portal period and potentially add another player, and that's the nature of what it is. So on paper, yeah, it looks rough simply because he was, quote unquote, a starter. But that's relative given that he was injured, in the first game of the season, and wasn't able to continue from that. Was it first or second? I can't remember now at this point. Either way, we don't really know what Utah lost out of that, right? Obviously, he was talked about a ton, gets the starter minutes opposite of Zemaiah Vaughn last year. Really expected him to do well, and he was doing well in the limited minutes that we saw. But the point is we don't really know. So unfortunate situation all around. Utah really wanted him, really expected him to be there. But, injuries, they come for anybody, right? And as we've seen, they can damage careers and futures and different things that way. So it's a tough situation. Utah will be fine. They've got plenty of depth at the corner position. And, let's be real. Like, this is a situation where Utah continues to be tested every single year in this position group. And you kind of got a hint of that in Morgan Scalley's comments at the press conference a couple weeks ago, where he talked about, he feels like they're always doubted in this position group and they continue to find ways to step up. Now, is it always, top tier? Is this the years that you have the Julian Blackmans, the Jalen Johnsons, the Cole Bishops, those types of players? No, it's not always that situation, right? But at the same time, they're finding ways to be effective with the guys that they have, and they coach them up really well. This is obviously one of the position groups because you've got corner and safety, we'll call it the secondary, that they do really well on and coach up players, and they get a lot from them, and everything works. So, look, losing a player that you didn't have all of last season, just means more minutes for somebody like a Scooby Davis. You get other players that can get in there that haven't been there. Smith Snowden obviously has been talked about as going to be more on the outside. There's potential there. There's obviously other guys in the works that are depth players that haven't been able to see the time, or they've gotten limited time. This is the one position group. Well, maybe not the one because there's others, but I feel confident that they'll be able to get something done. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be looking in the transfer portal, but I also don't think that this is a big need, right? Kyle Whittingham talked about the need to add a running back in the portal. Even though they've rebuilt that room and have some pretty good depth, they still want to be able to add there. But corner, to me, doesn't feel like it needs to be an immediate add. If there's, the best player available is a corner in the portal and they can get him, sure, you take him. But I don't think this is a situation where they're going to go looking primarily for just a corner, and that's like the top job, right? It's going to be running back, it's going to be defensive line, maybe defensive end, depending on who's available. Maybe you add another wide receiver if you need to. But those are primarily going to be your interests in the portal. So, I don't want to spend too much time on that. We're past this, so let's move on. One note to football. The Big 12 schedule is expected to be released next week. That's at least the word that I've got. Whether that actually happens, who knows? I've heard Monday. I've heard early next week. We'll see. I'm hoping that it does come. I mean, personally, it makes it easier for me to try to get my travel plans together. I know it's January, February, but I understand that's more for the fans than it is for me because mine's paid for by my company. But for fans, you want to go travel, you want to be able to go see these games, you want to know where you're going to go. My family has some travel this year that if we can time it up with Kansas, that would be great, just for them personally. So. There's we'll see. And I'm hoping next week when we come back for this podcast that we'll be able to have the schedule out. We'll break it down a little bit, look at what Utah has, kind of how it lays out, as well as kind of what the rest of the Big 12 looks like on a high level, right? Like as the year progresses, we will go through these and break them down like I did last year. Where I take two teams each week and kind of break them down on a high level and kind of get into it a little bit more. But for the most part, it's still a high level look because we don't know much about these. But we'll try to break these down next week if it does in fact come out, and hopefully we can continue to move forward with that. So looking forward to that. Also, NFL draft prep. This is it's still early to find out who are all the guys that are fully there. I don't think there's necessarily a guy that is, projected high. This isn't the Dalton Kincaid where you're going first round or a Devin Lloyd, that kind of stuff. But you've got, a guy in Junior Tafuna who has really shown out at Senior Bowl week, right? So the Senior Bowl is on Saturday, the official game. But this whole week they have their drills, where he's going up against the best players. And the reason this is important is the Senior Bowl is kind of the star of the quote-unquote all-star games, right? The players that are generally projected to be drafted. The Senior Bowl has a very high hit rate in terms of guys that go to the Senior Bowl and do get drafted. And so to be able to be a part of that, it's not a guarantee by any means, but it definitely shows that there's a lot of optimism about who you are as a player, right? And, sometimes going to this, you could lose value, your stock drops, so to speak. Other players gain value and that kind of stuff. So from the Utah side, Junior Tafuna was a late add. He was there in time to be able to start the week and everything, but he was a later add to the Senior Bowl. And then Karene Reed is also invited there. And by all accounts, both of them have been doing really well. Karene Reed obviously has much more of an uphill battle just simply based on his size. He's a smaller linebacker, so it's not your prototypical size. That's not to say that he's, not capable of doing it, but it does get tougher when you get into the league and you've got to contend with guys that are much bigger or have prototypical size. He's got to work harder to be able to get there. Once again, not impossible. But he just has to work harder to be able to get there. And by all accounts, he's done well. But I would say that Junior Tafuna has definitely improved his stock this week. Look, I'm not going to lie to you and say that I'm sitting there watching every highlight thing or anything or understand all the different things going on there. And I'm also not in Mobile to witness this. But all the accounts that I've seen on Twitter and the people that have written about this have said that Junior Tafuna is having a standout performance, right? So he's going up against some of the best players in college football for this draft, or I guess it's not college football anymore. It's the upcoming draft, prospects, we'll call it. And he's doing well. He's most definitely improved his stock. He's had a good showing, and so any of these GMs or coaches that are there witnessing this, they've gotten firsthand to witness firsthand that he's been able to do it against some of the top talent in the country. So that bodes well for him. Obviously, that means he could, go higher in the draft. Yeah, I haven't fully jumped into where these players are projected, and I think most of those aren't really great looks until after the Senior Bowl when these analysts and other people kind of look at it and kind of get the words from the GMs, kind of how things are shaking out. So a little too early for that, but by all accounts, like I said, he's doing well. So good for him. Good for Karene Reed for also doing well. We'll see how that pans out on Saturday. Most of the time, with so many players out there, they're not going to get a ton of reps out there. But if you can capitalize on the ones that you do get, that's going to obviously bode well for you in the draft. So I do know that Tafuna has been given an NFL Combine invite. His agent let me know. And so he'll be there. I don't know of any other players yet. I haven't gotten word from other players yet. Usually Utah gets a few. Based on Karene Reed being invited to the Senior Bowl, I wouldn't be surprised if he's there as well. But we'll see. So you've got that, as well as the Shrine Bowl was yesterday. This is kind of the second tier version of the Senior Bowl. There's plenty of guys in the Shrine Bowl that are going to be drafted, but generally, they're not going to be viewed as the higher level or the early round picks. Not to say any of them couldn't be, but this is generally players that are still kind of on the maybe not on the bubble is the right word, but they're definitely trying to prove themselves a lot more. I don't want to say a lot more because those guys at the Senior Bowl are trying to prove themselves, but I think the uphill battle is a little bit more for people in the Shrine Bowl. But being invited to either one of these is a good sign for you, and you just have to continue to maximize your efforts. And so Money Parks, he was not initially added to the roster. He was added late. If I remember right, it was either Tuesday or I'm pretty sure it was maybe even Wednesday. So only like a day before the Shrine Bowl took place. So it's tough to be able to get in there and get the early reps and everything to kind of show out that way. However, he did get in the game, and he was able to. He was on the West team. The West team lost 25-0, so not great. But he was targeted twice, had one reception for 23 yards. It came on a second and third pass from Ethan Garbers in the third quarter, and obviously maximized it with that. So bodes well for him in the sense that one of his catches went for 23 yards. But just being able to have one catch doesn't necessarily tell the full picture, right? It's all the stuff that leads up to that and everything. So curious to see what happens with Money. Obviously, fast guy. Was a great route runner. But will that translate to the NFL? We'll see. So I'll continue to monitor these types of things and kind of give you updates as much as possible. We'll see how it goes. But the draft isn't till April. There's still a lot to go. Combine's coming up soon, but there's still a lot of the training and different things that way. So, all right, for the rest of the podcast, I have a couple things. So earlier this week, I pulled the financial documentation from the University of Utah that was published. Each year, they have to publish a revenue and expenses report. It's an NCAA mandated. It's also audited by the state. So there's a lot of oversight on these types of things. So we'll talk about that. I know, finances isn't always the sexiest thing, and, I hope not to bore you. I'll try not to get too into the weeds on that, but clearly it's been a hot button issue if you look at my Twitter feed. So there's that. We'll also go over some other thing that's a hot button issue on my Twitter account. It's Bill Conley from ESPN. He's the guy who created SP+. He may have ranked Utah as one of his preseason playoff teams, and we'll kind of go over what that is, and then we'll kind of preview the Running Utes and the women's basketball team for this weekend and kind of what's going on there. So let's jump into finances, the most sexy, attractive topic that we can talk about right now, right? No, it's not fun. Personally, it's a necessary evil of my job, and I say that in the sense that I have to report on it, but it's not something that this isn't something that I look forward to every single year because it's ooh, I'm so excited. I mean, I'm excited to see how these things go. But at the end of the day, it's, an organization and how they manage finances. And, that's not really, it is what it is. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some interesting tidbits and different things. And I like to look at, I'm a numbers guy. I love my spreadsheets. So that's not to say that I don't love this type of stuff in some respects, but at the same time, this is what it is. So, they published their report. I don't know exactly when they published it. It's usually, mid to late January. I happened to look for it this week and then worked on the story and published it yesterday. But the big headline here is that Utah Athletics had a $17 million deficit. And, on the surface, that sounds really bad. Anytime you have a deficit, that's not good. But 17 millions is not great. And I'm going to try to provide some context into collegiate athletics because college athletics doesn't make the type of money that you think it does. Now, that's not to say that it's not making a lot of money. For example, Texas had record revenue this year at $300 million. So it makes a ton of money, right? And that was football. So there's other sports that make money, but by and large, outside of football and men's basketball, and in some schools you might make a profit in some other sports, but by and large, it's mostly those two sports. Football is obviously the king; they make the bulk of the money. It is kind of what everybody does because that's it's most popular and everything that way. And then men's basketball gets a lot more attention as well and is able to turn a profit most years for most schools. Well, I don't want to say most schools. I mean, even this, it's not easy to turn a profit for a lot of these programs. So if I remember right, there was a study done, not even a study because it's available data, but there's only something like 30 or 15 or something like that profitable programs on a year-to-year basis in terms of turning a revenue every single year. It's just not a high number. Football, men's basketball are used to finance the rest of the department. You can have your debates on whether that's good or bad. Obviously, from a football standpoint, that's frustrating because you're raking in all this money, and then it has to be paid out to all these other programs to sustain them. But on the same vein, for all the problems that the NCAA has, litigations and not being able to manage their own rules and all that kind of stuff, they absolutely are a big proponent of being able to help. They call it the Olympic sports, right? Gymnastics or softball, swimming and diving. Those types of things where, by and large, women or these other sports aren't generally going to get the same opportunity. Because as I mentioned, football and men's basketball are king. You see that in today's world where you have, the NFL and the NBA dominate. There's other leagues that do well, but it's not the same, right? And so it would be real easy for the NCAA to just be like, look, we're a football and men's basketball, organization. That's what we're going to focus on. And then it becomes much harder for any of these other things. So for as much as the NCAA is what it is and the struggles and doesn't really manage itself well, they've done a phenomenal job of being able to get other sports and other things an opportunity, right? A lot of these people, you look at, let's say, gymnastics at the Olympics. A big reason why, some of this is done well is to the credit of the NCAA. They've helped, establish some consistency and allowed these gymnasts to be able to have a platform. Obviously, a lot of these gymnasts come from the elite world and they're just going right into the Olympics and all that. So it's not a one-to-one, comparison. But at the same time, when you're building up these programs and you're trying to get best competition and you're giving them an outlet or a place to be able to do it at a high level, it does change things, right? And you allow people to be able to be in systems that are competitive, that aren't just club sports or team sports that travel the country and do different things. This is an opportunity to be able to be set up in a more structured setting. So, softball benefits from that. Swimming and diving benefits from that. Lacrosse benefits from that. Like, all of these sports benefit from the NCAA. So for as frustrating as that can be sometimes to be able to take that money and use it to subsidize these other programs, it's also a great opportunity to give more people, success. Now, depending on your feelings on how that should be divvied up, or should it be divvied up, that's up to you, right? And I can make a case for both. Personally, I think that we're getting to a point where the college football probably will/should separate from the rest of the sports. How that looks and what that would do to college athletics as a whole, remains to be seen. And it's easy to say that it should without realizing the full ramifications of that. But I think you're starting to see that it's going to start pulling away, especially now that athletes will soon be paid by the schools. Some of these schools are going to be investing 75, 80, 90% of their allotted revenue to football, and the rest of the programs, are going to be coming for less money. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see, this isn't a short-term thing by all means. I mean, it can be the way the NCAA has been moving lately, or maybe not even the NCAA, but legal action that has forced the NCAA to change things. gets into that. So enough kind of context on that. Back to it, Utah lost $17 million last year, and there's a big, well, it's last year, meaning the fiscal year for 2024. And what that means, it's July 1st, 2023 to June 30th, 2024. So essentially you can look at that, as the last year of Utah in the Pac-12. So anything that took place last year in terms of starting in the Big 12, that's not on this report. So it's essentially the last year of the Pac-12. I know that gets confusing for people. I had a lot of people on Twitter saying that, oh, well, how did that happen when Utah's a full member of the Big 12? That distribution hasn't come yet. That'll come in the next report because they're still currently in that fiscal year, right? They're still in that season, so to speak. And so it's not, you can't report that yet because it's not finished. So this is the last year that Utah's in the Pac-12. So to give that context, kind of let's dive into this. The big reasons why Utah has suffered a large deficit is that Comcast overpayment fiasco that the Pac-12 had. If you remember right, back in 2017, the Pac-12 found out that they'd been overpaying Comcast, and they decided to sit on it. They held back that information. They didn't announce it to anybody. Years later, in 2022, Comcast did their own audit and found out that they'd been overpaying the Pac-12, and it came out publicly. The Pac-12 finally had to fire a handful of people who knew this. How it was known from the commissioner's standpoint, it got messy, right? And so it was a tough situation that, you can look at and say these schools knew, and to an extent they probably did, probably didn't. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that aspect of it. But at the same time, the real life implications of that were you had to pay back the money, right? You can't just overpay for Comcast. And there's people that joke all the time. I've been overpaying for Comcast for years. I get it, right? Like, Comcast is not the cheapest. It's not the easiest to work with. Having been a Comcast subscriber years and years ago, it is not a fun situation. But that's not the point. This was the Pac-12 charging Comcast too much for what they were getting in their distributions, and so they had to pay that money back. So what that meant for Utah essentially is a $10.4 million swing. So in fiscal year 23, Utah got a $2.5 million distribution from this situation. I'm not going to get into that weeds, but they got $2.5 million that year. The next year they owed 7.9. Well, they were in the deficit of 7.9 million. So essentially, like I said, that's a $10.4 million swing. You essentially had to pay out a ton of money for this Comcast thing, and that's your biggest contributor to this $17 million. Something that's not fully in their control, but it's something that they had to do. It was agreed upon that it would come out of this fiscal year, and so that's the nature of it. Every single program that was part of the Pac-12 had to pay that, right? So this isn't something just unique to Utah. Every single program had to. Oregon had to pay that. USC, UCLA is a mess, by the way. Their finances aren't great. If I remember right, they lost $51.8 million that fiscal year. So not a great situation. But that's your biggest contributor to that. Not great. On top of that, you may remember as well that as the Pac-12, crumbled and Utah exited, and you can blame Utah, depending on what side of the aisle you are on that, as being part of breaking up the Pac-12. The remaining schools, Oregon State and Washington State, were able to get a court order that allowed them to withhold revenue. So essentially, these teams are paid out revenue every single year, whether that be, through units through their college basketball. So depending on how far a team goes in March Madness, each team is guaranteed a certain amount of money based on where that goes. So a team, let's say like Arizona, if they can make it to the Final Four, that benefits the entire conference. And the more teams you have do that, the more units you get and the more money that the conference makes. And so then that's eventually distributed evenly, and that's kind of where you get some of this stuff where there should be unequal distribution. Some of the top tier, that's what UCLA and USC were looking for initially. Oregon and Washington were kind of trying to get that when the Pac-12 was trying to stay together. That's kind of where some of that money comes from. And so, you would get the way the Pac-12 did it is they divvy it up equally. And so what happened is when these teams all decided to bolt, for the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the ACC eventually with Cal and Stanford, you left two teams that had no money. But they were able to get a court order to basically hold that money and say that they get to decide it, that they get to decide not to distribute that money. It eventually, settled out in court, and that meant that that each school had to pay a minimum of $5 million, plus there was a $1.5 million quote-unquote special circumstance fee that they had to pay. So, $6 million was being withheld, not they had to pay, but it was being withheld money that they were expecting that they didn't get. And so that one's one of those that, you can live with if you look forward and say, okay, it's fine, we're going to make more in the Big 12. Utah was always in a tricky position because they always wanted to stay in the Pac-12. That was where they were going to be. But once things started to crumble and Oregon and Washington decided to jump to the Big 10, it was not sustainable in their eyes to be able to stay in the Pac-12. And so they decided to bolt to the Big 12. Obviously, the Big 12 wanted them, Arizona's schools, and Colorado. Colorado had left the week prior, but each of them had to look at that. So, this isn't necessarily one of those sunken cost things where you're never going to get that money back. In theory, you were going to make more in the Big 12 marginally, at least based on the reports. And so you can live with that kind of money, right? But it's still an intended consequence of, compounding on the Comcast stuff. I mean, that adds to it at minimum, $16 million. You tack on legal fees, which if you can be a lawyer for the NCAA or going against the NCAA, you're set, man. Those billable hours have been phenomenal for lawyers this year. It's been a great situation and system for these lawyers. So great for them. Travel expenses has gone up, as anybody that's traveled, understands, it's not easy. And so some of those are there. But at the end of the day, the university was able to pay for this out of their surplus budget. So this isn't something that they're saying that they're going to raise stuff. Now, let's be honest, ticket sales are always going to be raised. There's always going to be different things, and you can be frustrated by, student fees and different things that way. That's up for you, to debate that way. I'm not going to get into that. But for the most part, an athletic department budget has to operate on whatever it brings in. And so, whatever football brings in and basketball brings in and all these other programs bring in, whatever they have from that is what they get. Yes, there are some supplemental stuff, right? Like I said, the student fees and different things that way. But for the most part, an athletic department has to operate separate from kind of the university to some extent. They have to bring in their own budget and then, try to bring a profit and have that in surplus and different things that way. So on one vein, ticket sales continue to improve. And obviously, if you raise tickets, that helps. But the football program saw nearly a $2 million increase from the previous fiscal year. They had, between all of the sports, it was $14.8 million last year. And so they feel confident that because these ticket prices and ticket sales are still flourishing and they're improving, that's a better indication that things are going okay. These other things, the Comcast, the Pac-12 exit, the legal fees associated with that, and travel, those are things, for the most part, are one-time things, and you're not going to have that, and so they feel like they're still in a good spot. Now, based on their trends, they have been, right? Like, there hasn't been anything there to indicate that Utah is in a hurt situation or that they're going to continue to lose money year over year. Yes, they did lose $31 million, for COVID. So that is something that you can look at. But by and large, since at least 2016, and that's as far back as I've gone recently, they've made at least $1.4 million every year in surplus. 1 year, let's see, their highest year that they've had a surplus, 3.8. That was fiscal year 2022. They also did that again in fiscal year 2018. But they hover around that $3 million number, $2 to $3 million. So they bring in a positive every single year. So, if you're a fan of Utah athletics, you can be happy about that. Looking at this from an individualized sport, I just want to kind of quickly go over this. Football last year, and that money, that distribution money where they had that, $7.9 million deficit came out of the football side of things, at least from an accounting side of things. And so revenue-wise, they brought in $79 million, but it was higher had you have taken that Comcast payment out of there. A year prior, let's see, what was it? A year prior, the university had brought in for football alone $92.5 million, which is a record for them. Most years they're about them 75. The next year before that, okay, that data wasn't working. So, anyways, so for the 95 or 92.5 million. The year before that, it was 75.7 million. This year it was 79 million. Had it been the Comcast distribution not being taken out of that, it's 80 million. It's already basically 80 million, so it's almost 90 million again. Doing well essentially. Their expenses were 52 million, so it's still a ton of money to operate a football program. It's not easy, but by and large, they made a profit of 26.8 million. Their profit the year before was 40.7 million, and the year before that was 35.7 million. So they're making a lot of money in football. Men's basketball, just quickly look at that. They made 12.9 million, expenses of 10.3 million for 2.6 million profit. Year before that was a $3.8 million profit, and the year before that was $1.4 million profit. So money is being made. Obviously, I've said that more can be done to enhance football or basketball and maybe get more support there, donations, whatever it may be to raise that. But they're sitting in a decent spot, right? I mean, like, basketball is doing well, despite all the frustrations that fans have with Craig Smith and this program. Maybe not even Craig Smith, but other people. It's still doing well. This year, women's basketball had a $4 million deficit. Gymnastics had a $1.9 million deficit. That's pretty consistent with where they're at. Women's basketball was a little bit higher than they're usually at, but not much. It's just tough to be able to operate in the black in those. Baseball was $2.2 million deficit. Beach volleyball, $157,000 deficit. So not really much. They don't bring in a ton, but they don't spend a ton. Golf was $845,000 deficit. All of these are deficits, so I'm going to stop saying deficit. Lacrosse, $804,000, which is actually less than the previous year. Lacrosse was doing better, so you can look at that as being an improvement. Skiing was $1.7 million, soccer $1.4 million, softball $1.6 million, swimming $2 million, tennis $1.7 million, and these are all rounded up. Sometimes it's or rounded down depending on where they're at. The law of rounding. Track and field, 1.6 million, and volleyball, 1.5 million. So, and volleyball also was less than the previous year. So lacrosse and volleyball had actually done better than the year before. Everybody else was either on par or lost more. But that's pretty consistent with most programs around the country. Like I said, football and men's basketball make it. Other places might do better. In the Midwest, it might be hockey, is sustainable and makes a profit. It's not much, honestly. So you look at those numbers and they're pretty standard, and it is what it is. Utah still turns a profit every year except for this year when they had the deficit. Looking at some other universities, just to kind of give you some context, Ohio State, for example, lost $37.7 million. They had that large of a deficit, and you look at Ohio State as obviously the pinnacle of collegiate football. Some of these other sports, but football isn't everything, right? Like, they're losing a lot of money. And so this is where, I'm curious to see as, athletes are starting to get paid and these departments are going to have to start investing money into these athletes, how that's going to change. Any of these programs that are operating at a high loss, like, you have to wonder, at some programs around the country, are they going to drop you? Are they going to essentially turn you into a club sport and just say, thanks, but no thanks. This is the real challenge. And so for as good as, I mentioned the NCAA has been, this is up to the member schools to be able to decide what sports they're going to operate. Now, there's a certain threshold that D1 programs and power conference programs have to operate. So you have to have the minimum threshold of athletic teams to compete and stay at that level. There's some schools like a Stanford who has like something in every single sport out there. They have something like 30, 40, 50 sports that they're competing in. In theory, they can afford to lose some of those things, but at the same time, their endowments and other things, pay for that kind of stuff. During COVID, Stanford talked about shuttering some of those programs and turning them into club sports, and they were met with a ton of blowback. But now that there's, year over year consequences in terms of how this money is going to go and how they pay, we'll see what happens. So, I've got no word at Utah that things are going to change. I continue to dig on that and try to see if as Utah weighs its future and how players are going to be paid. And a side note to that, the settlement hasn't been finalized yet, and so it's still kind of like the universities are preparing for it. I've talked to many people that have heard different things, and they have their understanding of what it's going to look like. It's similar to the athletes are getting 5-on-5 or 5 years to play 5 seasons. They're preparing for that as well. And so these athletic departments are ready in some respects, but it's still kind of a wait and see on what the actual final product will look like. So there hasn't been any word of programs being cut, nothing to that extent. But at the same time, if you are some of these other programs, you do have to worry, right? I mean, that's just the nature of it. My company went through a downsizing a little bit ago. You just have to worry about that wherever you're at. So it happens. There's not much you can do. But I'm curious to see how that shakes out. So just some other programs that have kind of what their finances were. Michigan State, they lost $16.7 million, so right around the same as Utah. UCLA, as I mentioned, $51.8 million. I mean, they're in a world of hurt. They also have Calamoni that they have to deal with. It's just it's a nightmare for a lot of these California schools. Missouri, $15.2 million, and Alabama, $28 million. So you can look at these programs. Some of these are the blue bloods of their respective sports. Usually football. All of these are generally good football programs and are going to have the most success there. If I remember right, Ohio State still had record revenue, but you still had a $37 million deficit. Alabama, similar things. I mean, it's tough, right? Texas had $300 million revenue, as I said, just in football. So it's interesting to see where this goes. What's going to happen with the House ruling? Will Utah be able to support every team? What's the best bang for your buck? That kind of stuff. It's tough. You look at that, and by and large, I don't want to say this because I don't think this is on the cutting block ever. But look, women's basketball is operating at a $4 million loss, right? That's clearly the highest of any of the programs. But I don't think you can just say we're going to cut women's basketball, especially with how the sport is growing, and things are going there. The problem is as you invest in that, you're also going to incur more costs. And so it's this tough world of what they're going to do. How is the market going to level out, that kind of stuff. So we'll see. I don't want to speculate too much because I don't think that's fair to any of these programs. They've got talented athletes wherever they are. Some of them, unfortunately, I'm not just saying at Utah, around the country, are going to be turned into club sports, and they're going to be forced to go that route. I don't know how that'll manage, or if football pulls away at one point. But these finances aren't easy. At the end of the day, though, as much as you have a $17 million loss, Utah feels optimistic. And, looking at the numbers, I'm not going to sit here and say that they're in a world of hurt. It happens. These things happen, and they were able to pay for it out of their surplus. And look, I'm not trying to go to bat for Utah by any means, but there's no indication that they are, on a downswing. They have some good years, some bad years. The year previous, yes, they were at one of their lowest that they've had, but that's not to say that it's a trend yet. So, who knows? We'll see how this goes. We'll see what this, we'll see what this first year of the Big 12 looked like. Obviously, Utah not getting to a bowl game hurts in terms of not getting bowl distributions and different things that way from their own stuff. But on the same vein, you don't incur bowl expenses, and those can be pretty hefty. So it kind of evens itself out to some extent on those things. But curious to see how this develops moving forward. Obviously, we won't know for another year on how that goes, but interesting nonetheless. All right, spent too much time on finances. You're probably bored, glossed over, and here we go. So let's just jump into this. This is similar to the conversation that I had earlier about, Devin Dampier and the Heisman conversation. Well, all these preseason things, they get frustrating to people. People look at it and they don't like the preseason hype. And once again, I'm going to say having expectations means that people expect something from you, right? That's the simple nature of it. And so as much as some fans want to play that underdog card, that's fine. I personally think that this is a good thing for Utah to be considered this, right? After arguably one of your worst years in Kyle Whittingham's tenure, Utah is still being looked at as a team that can potentially win the Big 12. By and large, as I mentioned, from a lot of the odds, it is an uphill climb. It's not a guarantee by any means. Even being picked as the favorite clearly is not going to be a guarantee. But the fact that, people that do this as a living continue to look at Utah as a potential contender means that there's expectations. Now, is that a scenario where we were always looking at Texas and saying, is Texas back? Yeah, maybe. Maybe there's a situation that way. Maybe everybody's looking at Utah as like, well, they're always good, so that means they have to be good this year. Maybe. We'll see. It'll be an interesting situation. But I think based on kind of what Bill Conley looked at, he makes a sound case for why he believes Utah's there. You can make a sound case for a lot of different teams, right? Like, for example, Iowa State, Kansas State, Arizona State, a lot of these teams, there's a sound, or BYU even, there's a strong case to be made that any one of them could lead the conference next year, right? And we'll see how it goes. So basically what he did is, as he did this, as I mentioned, he has his SP Plus predictions. He calculates these ratings every single week, and tries to identify kind of a rating system that ranks these teams. And he fine tunes this every single year, tries to tweak it to kind of improve it, because there's always some nuances that give him new perspective on things. And it's not a perfect science, right? It's why people complain that, the BCS system had a computer deciding who was going to be in the national championship game. You can't always rely on numbers because they don't always, tell the full story. And also teams have to back it up on the field. So, you can have Ohio State picked as the number one team in the country on SP Plus, and for the most times he did have Ohio State number one. But that doesn't mean that they don't go out and lose to Michigan, right? A team that they had no business losing to. But rivalries matter, and different things happen, and stuff happens. So they're mostly a guide, right? It's just a way to be able to look at these teams, try to put it in an objective formula that tries to weigh where they're at, what conference they're at, what teams they're playing, that kind of stuff, and tries to equalize it that way. So I appreciate the effort. Bill Conley does a phenomenal job. He's been kind of one of the fathers of advanced statistics for college football. There's a lot of these people out there. He's definitely not the only one, but obviously was one of the early adopters of it and trying to be able to identify these things and comes there. So he's always been one that I've looked at, and so we'll see what it is. I'm not I'm not using that to try to give credence to his pick for Utah. Personally, I don't really care. I think this is one of those things. It's another one of those preseason stuff to kind of hype up teams. But I talk about it because I think there's some substance to it, right? And so what he did is he wanted to see, he wanted to create this playoff card without just saying who are the best teams on paper, right? And that's an easy thing that all of us do as a member of the AP Top 25 voting class. There's a lot of that, of who is the best on paper. And quite honestly, in my AP voting, I do watch the games, but I also have Bill Conley's ratings in my spreadsheet that kind of help me as a secondary guide, right? It's not the only factor, and quite honestly, I don't know how much of a factor it is a ton. I use it to rank my teams in terms of resumes and different things that way, but it's not the only decider. But, I appreciate his effort to be able to say we're not just going to look at what's the best on paper. Now, to an extent, it's still that, right? Like, we're in January. We don't know anything about these teams. We don't know about the transfers, that kind of stuff. So it's there. But he did that to be able to say he created some rules around how he was going to do this. And so for each conference, he had specific rules. So, for his Big 12 rule is flip the close games around. So he was looking at games this last year where a team, maybe was in a lot of close games, aka Utah. And if you flip those games around, what was their season like? And then you look at kind of some of the other stuff that it came down to. And what he essentially came down to is Utah and Kansas as being those two teams that had the most games that could have been flipped, right? Kansas, obviously, they picked it up late, but they had some of those early results where they were close losses, and, you start out, what was it, 0-4 or something like that? I can't remember what they were at. But he essentially narrowed it down to Utah and Kansas as having consistency as well as being the ones that were in that mix. And so he was able to kind of look at it from that spot. And so he said, quote, despite collapsing offensively, the Utes still boasted a top 20 defense per SP plus and lost 5 games by a total of 23 points. They'll have a chance to charge right back up the standings. All they need is to find a QB1, probably New Mexico transfer Devin Dampier, and keep him on the field. And so because of that, he felt like Utah was the best one to win the Big 12. And so how his system went in, as he did that, he had them winning the Big 12 and getting the number 3 seed, so they'd get the bye in that first round. So essentially the byes were Georgia being number 1, they'd win the SEC. Penn State would win the Big 10, and Penn State, man, they're building. And the fact that they just got Jim Knowles from Ohio State shows that they're serious about this. So I wouldn't be sleeping on Penn State by any means. There's a real possibility that they could be the number 1 team coming into the 2025 season. So watch out for them. I think they've got some good, a bunch of players coming back. They're essentially trying to take the Ohio State model, which took the Michigan model, to be able to bring a lot of these players back and try to go for one more year. So really curious to see how they handle that. James Franklin obviously has to win those big games that he just has had such a hard time doing it. He's close. He just can't do it. But either way, Conley's picking them to win the Big Ten, and I think that's probably a safe pick right now. There is still Ohio State. There's still Oregon. There's still Michigan, so that's a tough one. As I mentioned, Utah wins the Big 12 as the 3rd seed, and then Louisville wins the ACC. Another good team in the mix. We'll see how it pans out. But in his bracket, he has Boise State playing at Alabama, so 12v5. North Carolina, Bill Belichick gets the Tar Heels into the playoffs as an 11 seed, playing at Texas, who is a 6 seed. LSU, which is another team that I think could be dangerous this year, playing it as a 10 seed against number 7 Notre Dame. That may be a low pick, honestly, for Notre Dame. I think they could be sneaky good again. Sneaky good. They were just in the national championship game, so it's hard to call them that. But either way, I think that might be low for them. And then Ohio State, number 9, at Michigan at number 8. That would be pretty phenomenal to be able to have that in a playoff setting, but we'll see. So essentially how he had it, as I said, Utah as a 3 seed, he has, they get the first round bye. So Texas, he has them beating North Carolina, and then Utah beating Texas before falling to Penn State, which he calls his eventual champions. Interesting. I think it's a fun little experiment to see what happens. Most of those teams I could see being in that 12-team playoff. But it's easy to see some of them not there, right? Utah absolutely could not be in there. Louisville could not be in there. Georgia could not be in there. We'll see. We'll see how these teams go. But I think it's a pretty solid list based on how that is. Once again, looking at that, though, Utah would be the only Big 12 team. The Big 12 has to do more to be able to get multiple teams in there. Louisville, if I remember, no, they're the 2 teams because North Carolina's in there. It's always going to be a debate with ACC and the Big 12. Big 10 and SEC is always going to take the bulk of those teams, and generally for good reason. But I think, as you saw, it doesn't always have to be that. And I think you're starting to see more success coming out of the Big 10, whereas the SEC isn't necessarily this massive product that everybody, needs to bow down to. And so I'm curious to see how this continues to evolve and how it develops. Obviously, there's continual talk on if you expand it to 14 or 16 or different things that way, but we'll see. Right now, this is what we're at, and I think it's still a great system. Is it perfect? No, but at the same time, it's better than what we had, so we'll see what happens. So could Utah be in that mix? Sure, right? I think Utah has the talent, but at the same time, I still kind of want to see some of this go through in spring. I am high on this Utah team and what they're able to do, at least based on paper. But once again, I've seen what that is, right? You can be high, on paper, and then it doesn't pan out on the field based on circumstances. So we'll see. But I wouldn't go into the season probably saying that Utah is going to be the favorite by any means. As I mentioned on the last podcast, I see them, in the top tier, but maybe I wouldn't be surprised if they were at the bottom of that tier based on how teams are going to be, on how the rest of the teams are going to be viewed. Arizona State's going to be ranked high. BYU is going to be ranked high. Iowa State, Kansas State, those types of teams. Kansas, once again, will be there. So it's not going to be an easy voting system for a lot of these people, and I wouldn't be surprised if, like I said, Utah comes in at like 6th or 7th. But, based on the feedback that I've gotten on Twitter, you guys are okay with that. You want them to have that underdog mentality. So, we'll go with that. I don't want to go too long, but just looking at the Running Utes. So the Running Utes, they got their win over Cincy. Wild game. Wild in the sense that it was not very great. And not very great in that it was bad offensively. This is a team that, they have these moments where they can be so good. They have talent. They play together as a team. They work well. They assist at a high level. Like, this is probably one of Craig's best assist teams, best rebounding teams. And then suddenly they just stop. They get into the system where, they have this free-flowing movement and the ball is, going inside out or kicking it out and different things that way. And they're effective. And then suddenly after they get this success, it just kind of stalls. You have, Lawson Lovering up top. He's directing the offense. And I did ask Craig about this because I was curious why he has his big up there instead of closer to the post. And in his view, it's kind of more spreading it out, as well as he believes that Lawson is one of the best passers on the team. And he wants to be able to have him integral in setting up that offense. Now, the problem that's there, and we've seen this, is it kind of stops. And it doesn't become this free-flowing offense. And for as good of a passer as Lawson can be at times, it seems like it's just running around him off of screens and doing different things to be able to kind of get, Gabe open or somebody else open. And then the rest of the guys are just standing still. It has opportunities, but as, I tell my kids when they were growing up in basketball, you've got to move. You can't just stay put all the time, and there's some reason to stay put to some extent. But you've got to move, because if not, you're making that defender not work. And if that defender doesn't have to work, it's much easier for him to do something else. And that's what I see a lot with this team, is you have a team that when the ball is moving and it's a free-flowing offense, things are going well. And they have, they can compete with most teams in the league. That's not to say that they're going to beat them or have better talent or skill than them, but they can compete with them. And you see that in these games where they do that. And it's always even within the game situation where they'll do that, and then suddenly they go on a 6-minute scoring drought or a 10-minute scoring drought from the field. And a lot of that is largely because of turnovers, and it's largely because they just stand still. And so you've got somebody like Gabe who's coming off of a screen and trying to work, but they're going to sell out to try to make sure that he doesn't get 3-point shots. But as he's, dancing around the 3-point line or trying to get in, whether it to be to drive or whatever it may be, the rest of the guys are standing there and not really being an active part of the offense. And so it becomes a challenge for this team. As I mentioned on a previous podcast, this is a team that is generally full of role players. There's not really a star on this offense. Gabe can obviously be that if he's making his shots, and he's still somebody that you're going to probably trust late in the clutch situation. You want the ball in Gabe's hands, and obviously he's had his moments, but I'd trust him more than anybody else on that team. Now, to that point, Ezra Sarr is definitely making strides, and I think you're seeing a ton of potential out of him, as I've mentioned many times, but you're starting to see it really click for him. And Craig Smith yesterday, when he was talking to us, said that he was most impressed with how vocal Ezra is starting to become. Craig says he loves to watch cut-ups of the actual game footage from TV. He wants to hear how loud people are. He wants to be able to see that view, and so he can kind of get a different angle of it. And he said he was noticeably taken aback by how loud Ezra was in communicating. You could hear it through the TV screen. And so to him, that's showing a guy that is starting to become much more confident, understanding his ability and what he can be for that team. He said there's been a lot of things inside the locker room where Ezra's starting to step up. And I think you're starting to see it where, Craig says he's growing up before our eyes, and you're seeing it on the floor as well. Ezra's one of those players where, a month from now, as Utah gets into March, you can see tremendous strides from where he is already with what he's done in January. So as much as I say Gabe Madsen is your star, I think Ezra is probably turning into that guy. Now, he still needs to develop a jumper outside. He can do it. He hit a three-pointer. He actually has a pretty decent shot Free throw shooting obviously needs to improve, and he understands that, and it's something that he's continually working on. But I think, for his game, as it continues to refine and he continues to get more confidence, I absolutely believe Ezra could be a star of that team. Now, what that means, I don't know. Obviously, if they can keep some consistency and bring him back next year at Utah, that bodes well. Utah's done a phenomenal job with their bigs coach, Josh Eilert, and being able to coach these guys. You're seeing legitimate progress out of Keanu Dawes, Ezra, Lawson Lovering. Quite honestly, Lawson a couple years ago, he wasn't the guy that you were going to turn to. Granted, you had Brandon Carlson, right? And so you were going to have to hit the ball in his hands, but Lawson somewhat became a liability at times. He was generally a good defender, but wasn't always in the right spot and, fouled or was a little too aggressive at times. You're starting to see much more maturation out of him and an ability in his progress there. And I credit that to, coaching them up really well, and I've seen it. So anyways, in that game, they had 19 turnovers, which translated to 21 points for Cincinnati. Utah actually won it down the stretch with free throws, which is kind of surprising. They also had a massive disparity in rebounds. As I mentioned, this is a thing that Craig has emphasized. He said last year's team, he was 100% frustrated with how they weren't able to rebound the ball. He was visibly frustrated in how that was not his MO, right? He's always had a team that has been one of the best rebounding teams in the country, and he wanted to return to that. So he emphasized that in his recruiting, and you're starting to see that, right? They're much more physical down there. They're winning rebounding battles, especially on the offensive glass, giving them second chance opportunities. Now, obviously, Utah has to make those, but and that's a work in progress still. But they're doing better. So as much as Utah's not necessarily going to be an NCAA tournament team, you're seeing progress out of this team. And if they can bring some consistency and bring that together for another season, maybe there's a chance next year. There's still a chance this year, and you can continue to get hot. They're, like I mentioned, they're on a good run right now where they're going to go to Oklahoma State. They've got some other teams that are winnable games, and so there's opportunities there. But this is a team that it's just not consistent. And they're much more improved than maybe some of the teams of years past in terms of consistency and talent and depth, but it's still not quite there yet. And I think I think this is where Utah has to decide: are they going to invest in another year of this? And if they can get these guys back, how much better can they be? But we'll see. So, lastly, women's basketball, they have a game tonight against Arizona. Second game of the season against Arizona. These are always tight battles, close battles. Arizona's a scrappy team, and Utah, hasn't always had an easy time against them. But it's a fun environment. Gianna Neepkins is obviously on a tear and has had back-to-back career-setting games in scoring, and so she's back to fine form. She looks more comfortable out there, like she realizes she's back to who she has been before her injury. Maya Torre has been doing really well, and obviously a player that needs to consistently put it together. Kennedy McQueen, it's still TBD if she's going to be on a minutes restriction for tonight, if you're listening to this on Friday. But Gavin Peterson, the new head coach, says that she's been doing really well. She's making a lot of progress. She's doing the things to rehab the proper way. She's gotten back faster than they expected her to. And he sees a scenario where she potentially could play, her full minutes tonight. So really curious to see how that goes. When she's in there, she's a difference maker. Before she was injured, she was really getting on a hot streak where she was, consistently knocking down threes, being a consistent threat there, which obviously opens up the game for Maya. It opens up the game for Gianna and then all these other players. It also has the benefit of putting Maddie as the sixth person off the bench, which helps. She's a starter caliber. It's not that she can't be that, but I think when you have her leading the second unit, that absolutely helps. So really curious to see how this game plays out. It's at the Huntsman Center. Should be a fun atmosphere. Once again, this is a team that continues to do really well as they try to work towards their March run. And, I think you're starting to see a team that's believing in itself more. They still have these moments where it doesn't always click, but I think you're starting to see Gianna take that step forward again. She's starting to believe in herself. It takes a while to get off of that injury rehab and to kind of feel confident and comfortable in what you can do on the court. And you're definitely seeing that. I'd say early on in the season, it's not that she looked slow, but she looked hesitant, right? Like I think she was still kind of not fully trusting her rehab, and kind of understanding the situation she could put herself in. Now you're starting to see that where she's, back to that same self where she's aggressive, she's a spot up shooter, she, creates her own shot, and that's what matters, is creating your own shot, and she's that player on this team. And so I think as long as she continues to be the facilitator of the offense that way, and I know the ball's not always in her hand, and Nash obviously has the ball, but she creates the offense in terms of how she sets it up with her, creating her own shot and what she's able to do. That helps this team. And obviously if Kennedy's back, she's a big, vital role in that spot as well. So really curious to see how this goes tonight. Should be fun. Utah's, it's getting closer to the end of their season. We still have a whole month of February, but this goes fast. And then it's suddenly Big 12 tournament time at the first week of March, and Utah's looking for its run. So it'll be interesting. Looking forward to it. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about with these different teams, and we'll continue to do so. Red Rocks have a meet on Sunday. They travel to West Virginia, where they will also compete with Florida, who got a 198. There's some interesting things going on with scoring, and so we'll kind of talk about that. So hopefully next week we can get some Big 12 schedules for football. We'll talk some more stuff, but with that, we'll sign off, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.